Staff Sergeant Michael Mick Harrison thought he would get a normal military room when he came to Remote Station Alpha 7. He did not expect the strangest welcome gift anyone ever got at a space frontier assignment. The station sat at the edge of contested space like a lighthouse for diplomacy. It was neutral ground for peace talks between human colonial forces and Valkyrie territorial defenders. Their conflicts had been getting worse and worse, moving toward full war. But both sides seemed to want to find another way instead of destroying each other completely. When Sergeant Harrison arrived, Base Commander Colonel Peterson met him in the main briefing room. Her face showed professional politeness, but also something else. She looked like she was about to tell him information that would completely change what he thought routine military service meant. "Welcome to Alpha 7. I hope your trip from Earth Central Command went smoothly," she said. "Yes, ma'am. I'm ready for security work and whatever frontier hospitality means at joint human-alien facilities," Mick replied. "About that," Colonel Peterson said. She turned on displays showing the station's strategic position in the contested border zone. "Your job includes responsibilities that go beyond standard security work. We have a unique situation. It needs someone with your psychological profile and military experience." Mick looked at the tactical displays carefully. He noticed that Alpha 7's isolation made it very important for keeping communication between species. But it also made it dangerously exposed to sabotage. That kind of sabotage had been destroying other diplomatic facilities all through the frontier zone. "What kind of unique situation?" he asked. Before Colonel Peterson could answer, the briefing room doors opened. In walked what seemed to be the answer to his question, 2 6-year-old Valkyrie girls. Their pointed ears and glowing markings showed they were alien. But their calm manner and smart eyes suggested they were much more than simple refugee children needing help. "Sergeant Harrison," Colonel Peterson said carefully, like someone delivering news that would either make perfect sense or create the most expensive diplomatic incident of his career. "Meet Lyra and Miravel. They've been put in your care under ancient protocols we're still learning to understand." Mick stared at the twins. Then at Colonel Peterson. Then back at the children. They were watching him with focused attention, like they were judging him by rules he couldn't even guess. "Ma'am, I think there's been some kind of administrative mistake. I'm supposed to do security work, not childcare involving alien minors at a military facility," he said. "There's no mistake," Colonel Peterson replied. Her face showed she understood his confusion, though. "Lyra and Miravel need a guardian. Their culture has specific requirements for who can be trusted to protect them. Your character and skills meet those requirements." "And you think I meet those requirements based on what?" Mick asked. "Based on psychological tests, military service records, and how you respond to crisis situations. These show someone who puts protection over personal convenience or political advantage." The colonel turned on personnel files showing assessments Mick didn't remember taking. Also based on the twins' own judgment. "They've been evaluating you since you arrived." Mick looked at Lyra and Miravel. He noticed they'd been watching his reactions with careful attention. His responses to unexpected information were being analyzed for things he wasn't aware he was showing. "You've been evaluating me?" he said to the twins. They both nodded seriously, showing the evaluation was both important and still happening. "Your heart sounds steady when surprised," Lyra said in carefully spoken Standard Galactic. Her voice had the musical accent that marked Valkyrie's speech. "Not angry or scared, just curious. And you ask questions about understanding rather than control," Miravel added. Her glowing markings pulsed with colors that cultural briefings had said meant approval or happiness. Papa said to look for that in potential guardians. Papa, our father, was the previous bond warden, Lyra explained matter-of-factly, the way children talked about things adults found complex. He protected the hidden vault until the bad people made him have an accident. Colonel Peterson's face grew dark at the twins' casual mention of their father's death. General Velaying was killed 6 months ago. It looked like equipment failure, but it was actually murder designed to make the defensive vault impossible to access. Defensive vault? Mick asked. Ancient Valkyrie technology that's been secretly protecting this station and several frontier settlements from sabotage, infiltration by corporate agents, and systematic attacks designed to eliminate diplomatic facilities. Colonel Peterson turned on classified displays showing defensive systems Mick hadn't known existed. The twins are the genetic keys needed to turn on technology that works through consciousness integration. It needs both their biosignatures and a human guardian whose psychological profile shows trustworthiness. Mick felt his comfortable understanding of a routine security assignment falling apart. He realized his frontier duty involved much more than perimeter defense and equipment maintenance. So by accepting responsibility for their care, I become what exactly? He asked. Bond Warden, Miravel said helpfully. Guardian of the defensive systems that keep the peace talks from being destroyed by people who like profitable wars more than successful negotiations. It's a big responsibility, Lyra added with serious consideration that suggested she understood the meaning better than most adults. But Papa said humans could be good bond wardens if they cared more about protecting people than controlling technology. Mick looked around the briefing room. Other personnel were watching his interaction with the twins. Their faces suggested his decision would affect more than just childcare arrangements. And if I say no to this guardianship? He asked. Then the defensive vault stays locked. The station becomes vulnerable to the same corporate sabotage that destroyed other diplomatic facilities. The peace negotiations fail while corporate interests make money from military contracts, Colonel Peterson said with brutal honesty. Also, Lyra and Miravel stay without protection from the same interests that killed their father to control defensive technology. Mick looked at the tactical displays showing hidden defensive systems that had been protecting the station. Then he looked at the 2 alien children. Their obvious intelligence matched their need for someone willing to accept responsibility for both their safety and the security of everyone who depended on diplomatic success. Corporate interests were trying hard to prevent that success. Lyra, Miravel, he said, getting down to their eye level. He noticed their glowing markings were changing to colors that meant hope mixed with careful judgment. Your father was protecting important defensive systems that keep people safe during peace negotiations, right? He was protecting everyone from the bad people who want the talks to fail so they can sell more weapons and steal more planets, Lyra confirmed with the directness children brought to complex political situations. And you need a new guardian who can help you keep those protections working? Mick asked. We need someone who will care about protecting people more than controlling powerful technology, Miravel said. Her violet eyes met his with assessment that suggested his answer would decide whether she trusted him with responsibilities affecting thousands of lives. Mick felt the weight of unexpected responsibility settling around him. It was like a complicated piece of equipment he'd be learning to use under the most stressful conditions imaginable. But the twins' obvious need for protection and the station's vulnerability to corporate sabotage made his decision pretty straightforward. Well, he said, standing up. Both children were watching him with faces that mixed hope with continued judgment. I've always been terrible at saying no to assignments that involve protecting people who can't protect themselves. Looks like I'm about to learn what bond warden duties mean. Just then, alarms began sounding throughout the station. This showed that corporate agents had been monitoring his decision. They were already moving to stop the defensive vault from being turned on. Mick realized his simple frontier security assignment had just changed into protecting two remarkable children and their people's defensive legacy. He had to protect them from interests that wanted diplomatic facilities to stay vulnerable to the kind of profitable conflicts that created military contracts instead of successful peace negotiations. The hidden vault existed beneath Remote Station Alpha 7 like a technological cathedral. It had been waiting centuries for the right combination of genetic codes and human psychology to unlock its secrets. Lyra and Miravel led Mick through access tunnels that hadn't appeared on any map he'd studied. They went past defensive systems that had been secretly protecting the station while staying invisible to both human sensors and corporate surveillance networks. The Bond Warden right, Lyra explained as they went down toward the vault's entrance, creates partnership between human psychology and Valkyrie technology. This prevents misuse of defensive systems. Papa said humans think differently about protection than most species, Miravel added. Her small hand found Mick's with the kind of trust that suggested she'd already decided he was worthy of the responsibility they were offering. You protect because you care, not because you want to control. The vault's entrance needed both twins to put their hands on bioscanners while Mick spoke formal acceptance words. These created legal and technological bonds spanning both species' authority structures. The moment the protocols turned on, Mick felt his consciousness expand. It now included awareness of defensive networks stretching across multiple star systems. These were protecting not just Alpha 7, but dozens of frontier settlements from corporate-sponsored attacks that had been systematically destroying diplomatic facilities. The defensive systems are extraordinary, he said. He was accessing monitoring networks showing real-time protection of settlements throughout the contested zone. These aren't just local facility defenses. They're comprehensive early warning and response networks that can coordinate protection across entire sectors. Our ancestors understood that peace requires active protection from those who profit from war, Lyra said with wisdom that suggested Valkyrie children learned about defensive philosophy along with basic language skills. The Bond Warden partnership makes sure powerful technology serves protection rather than conquest. The vault's central chamber had crystalline interfaces. These responded to both the twins' biosignatures and Mick's psychological patterns. It created a hybrid control system needing cooperation between human strategic thinking and Valkyrie defensive technology. The display showed not just current defensive status, but historical records. There were records of attacks that had been stopped, infiltration attempts that had been detected, and sabotage operations that had been prevented through automated systems corporate interests didn't know existed. The recent equipment failures at the station, Mick realized, reviewing defensive logs showing a pattern of corporate sabotage attempts. They weren't random mechanical problems. They were systematic infiltration attempts blocked by hidden defensive protocols. Bad people have been trying to break the defensive system so they can destroy the peace talks, Miravel confirmed. She was accessing displays showing corporate agents throughout the frontier zone. But the defenses work best when they have a Bond Warden who understands that protecting people is more important than protecting secrets. Mick looked at the evidence of systematic corporate conspiracy. The attacks on diplomatic facilities hadn't been random terrorism. They were coordinated campaigns designed to make sure peace negotiations failed while keeping corporate involvement hidden behind plausible deniability. How many other Bond Wardens are currently active? He asked. None, Lyra said quietly. Her glowing markings shifted to colors showing sadness mixed with determination. Papa was the last one before the bad people made him have his accident. The other Guardians were killed through equipment failures, atmospheric problems, and accidents that weren't really accidents. Which is why corporate interests have been able to destroy other diplomatic facilities while this station stayed protected, Mick understood. He felt the weight of responsibility settling around him as he realized he was now the only person with access to defensive technology that could prevent the systematic elimination of peace negotiation efforts. And why my acceptance of the Bond Warden role is so strategically significant, he added. The Bond Warden partnership gives authority over defensive networks, but also responsibility for making sure they serve protection rather than exploitation, Miravel explained. She turned on displays showing the scope of his new authority. The technology responds to intention and character rather than just clearance levels or political authorization. Mick felt their shared consciousness beginning to blend as the bond deepened. It revealed not just technical abilities, but the emotional resonance that made Valkyrie defensive technology so effective. The systems didn't just detect threats. They detected the intentions and psychological patterns showing whether someone wanted to protect or exploit vulnerable populations. The corporate agents infiltrating the station, he said, accessing threat assessment displays revealing the scope of the conspiracy. They're not just trying to sabotage peace negotiations. They're trying to control defensive technology that could be used for conquest rather than protection. Which is why the Bond Warden right requires partnership with humans whose psychology puts protection over control, Lyra said. Her consciousness touched his through the technological interface. Your species understands that the most powerful defensive abilities should serve the vulnerable rather than the ambitious. As alarms continued sounding throughout the station, corporate infiltrators were moving to prevent the defensive activation. They wanted to eliminate inconvenient Bond Wardens before they could expose the conspiracy. Mick realized his acceptance of responsibility for 2 alien children had changed into protecting the future of diplomatic cooperation. He had to protect it from interests that saw peace as an obstacle to profitable warfare. Lyra, Miravel, he said, feeling their trust in his own protective instincts settling into the kind of partnership that made advanced defensive technology possible. Your father protected these systems until corporate interests killed him. Papa said the most important protection was making sure the right person could continue the work if something happened to him, Miravel replied with matter-of-fact acceptance that children showed toward things adults found tragic. He said humans could be good Bond Wardens because you understand that protecting people requires being willing to accept responsibility even when it's dangerous. And now we're your responsibility, Lyra added with a smile suggesting she found the situation more hopeful than concerning. But you're also our partner in protecting everyone else from the bad people who like profitable wars more than successful peace. Mick looked at the defensive displays showing real-time protection of settlements throughout the frontier zone. Then he looked at the 2 remarkable children whose trust had made him responsible for technology that could either save or doom diplomatic efforts throughout contested space. Well, he said, turning on the formal Bond Warden protocols that would make their partnership official while simultaneously making all of them permanent targets for corporate elimination. I've always believed the most important military work involves protecting people who can't protect themselves. Looks like I'm about to learn whether that philosophy works for protecting entire civilizations from corporate war profiteering. As they prepared to make the Bond Warden partnership official, which would give them joint authority to expose the conspiracy while making them permanent targets for elimination, Mick realized something. His routine frontier assignment had changed into accepting responsibility for the survival of peace negotiations that corporate interests had been systematically destroying throughout the contested zone. The Bond Warden activation triggered immediate responses from monitoring systems throughout both the station and the broader frontier command structure. Rival officers and corporate agents scrambled to control or eliminate Mick's new authority over defensive systems. These systems could decide the outcome of territorial negotiations and the survival of diplomatic efforts throughout the contested zone. Within hours of the bonding, Mick found himself at the center of political maneuvering that made routine security work look simple. The Bond Warden's status cannot be legitimate, Major Rise announced during the emergency command briefing. His tone carried barely controlled anger about what he saw as unauthorized assumption of alien authority. Sergeant Harrison lacks the security clearance, cultural training, and command authority necessary to control defensive systems affecting multiple star systems. The Bond Warden right, Colonel Peterson replied with patient professionalism, operates under cultural law that existed before human involvement in the sector. The twins' genetic codes combined with Sergeant Harrison's psychological profile created legitimate authority. Our command structure is required to recognize it under interspecies cooperation protocols. Mick listened to the debate while reviewing intelligence data his enhanced access was now providing. He used the Bond connection to trace systematic infiltration extending far beyond simple sabotage attempts. The corporate conspiracy was more sophisticated than station security had realized. It involved coordinated elimination of defensive personnel and systematic corruption of command structures. This left diplomatic facilities vulnerable to attacks that looked like terrorist actions rather than corporate profit protection operations. The defensive systems aren't just protecting the station, he reported to Colonel Peterson during a brief break in the command proceedings. The Bond access is showing that corporate agents have been systematically infiltrating frontier facilities to disable protective networks. These networks have been preventing attacks on diplomatic personnel and peace negotiation efforts. What kind of infiltration? Colonel Peterson asked. Personnel placement in key security positions. Modification of equipment to create weaknesses that can be used during coordinated attacks. And systematic elimination of individuals whose knowledge or authority might interfere with corporate control over frontier defensive abilities. Mick showed her evidence painting a disturbing picture of manipulation spanning the entire frontier zone. The Bond Warden Authority provides access to intelligence networks revealing the scope of corporate coordination in preventing successful peace negotiations. And the twins' role in this conspiracy? Lyra and Miravel aren't just genetic keys to defensive technology. They're the last surviving members of the Valkyrie bloodline that can turn on ancient defensive systems designed to protect against exactly the kind of systematic attack corporate interests have been conducting. Mick felt their shared consciousness revealing information normal intelligence gathering couldn't access. Their father and other Bond Wardens were killed specifically to prevent access to defensive abilities that could expose and counter corporate sabotage. Colonel Peterson's face grew dark as she processed the meaning. So by accepting guardianship, you've become the only person with authority to turn on defensive systems that could protect diplomatic efforts throughout the frontier zone. And the only person with access to intelligence networks that can expose the systematic nature of corporate conspiracy to prevent peace negotiations through elimination of protective capabilities and defensive personnel. Mick accessed tactical analysis revealing the scope of planned attacks. The corporate strategy involves coordinated assault on remaining diplomatic facilities while eliminating Bond Wardens who might turn on defensive systems that could prevent the attacks or expose their corporate sponsorship. The Bond connection was also showing that several station personnel had been compromised by corporate interests. This created security weaknesses that would be used during the planned assault on Alpha 7. The defensive systems had been detecting infiltration attempts for months. But without a Bond Warden to authorize active countermeasures, the station had been gradually becoming more vulnerable to the kind of coordinated attack that had destroyed other diplomatic facilities. The equipment failures and communication breakdowns, Mick realized, accessing defensive logs showing patterns of systematic sabotage. They've been testing attacks designed to find weaknesses that can be used during a larger assault. And my assignment to this facility? Was specifically requested by corporate agents who wanted to make sure any potential Bond Warden would be someone whose military record suggested compliance with authority rather than independent decision-making that might interfere with corporate objectives. Mick felt the pieces fitting together as he understood how completely the conspiracy had tried to control personnel assignments. They didn't expect me to accept guardianship of the twins or turn on defensive systems that could expose their infiltration. But the intelligence they were gathering through the bond also showed that Valkyrie Minister Corvith had been working with human corporate interests. This was to make sure traditional Valkyrie reluctance to trust human guardians would prevent Bond Warden activation. It would leave defensive systems inaccessible during the planned attacks. The false flag operation, Mick said, accessing strategic intelligence through his enhanced authority, is designed to eliminate the station while making it look like the result of extremist attacks rather than corporate sabotage of diplomatic facilities. Corporate operatives will do the assault while evidence is planted suggesting Valkyrie extremists attacked their own people to prevent peace negotiations with human colonial forces. Which serves two purposes, Colonel Peterson confirmed. Her face showed station intelligence had been tracking similar patterns at other facilities. Eliminating defensive capabilities and creating justification for military rather than diplomatic solutions to territorial disputes. Mick looked around the command facility. The bond connection was showing which personnel had been compromised by corporate interests and which could be trusted during the coming assault. The choice between keeping Bond Warden status and giving it up isn't just about personal responsibility for two children, he said, understanding the true stakes for the first time. It's about whether diplomatic efforts throughout the frontier zone have any chance of surviving systematic corporate sabotage designed to ensure profitable conflicts rather than successful peace negotiations. The formal Bond Warden ceremony gives you permanent authority to coordinate defensive operations while providing protection against elimination attempts that target guardians who might expose corporate conspiracy, Colonel Peterson said. Her face showed she understood the meaning. But the ceremony also makes you, the twins, and anyone supporting the defensive activation permanent targets for interests that want diplomatic facilities to stay vulnerable to profitable attacks. Mick looked at the evidence of systematic conspiracy. Then he looked toward the secured area where Lyra and Miravel were waiting for his decision. Would he make the partnership official, granting them joint authority to expose corporate manipulation while making all of them permanent targets for elimination? Colonel, my military training taught me the most important security work involves protecting people from threats they can't identify or counter on their own, he said. And your assessment of our current threat situation? Our current threat involves corporate interests using systematic sabotage and murder to prevent diplomatic facilities from succeeding while making sure defensive capabilities stay unavailable to counter attacks that serve profit margins rather than either species' actual security needs. Mick accessed the formal bonding protocols that would make his partnership with the twins permanent. That seems like exactly the kind of systematic threat that needs coordinated defensive response from people whose personal bonds guarantee they'll put protection over corporate convenience. As they prepared to make the Bond Warden partnership official, which would give them joint authority to counter the corporate conspiracy while making all of them permanent targets for elimination by interests that profited from vulnerable diplomatic facilities, Mick realized something. His simple frontier security assignment had changed into protecting the future of peaceful coexistence from forces that saw diplomatic success as an existential threat to profitable warfare. The corporate assault on remote station Alpha 7 started during the formal Bond Warden ceremony. Infiltrated personnel turned on sabotage systems while external operatives launched coordinated attacks designed to eliminate the defensive capabilities. They wanted to create evidence that extremist groups were responsible for destroying their own diplomatic facilities. The ceremony itself took place in the hidden vault. Mick and the twins used their combined authority to turn on ancient defensive networks while exposing the corporate agents who had been systematically undermining frontier security. Corporate infiltrators are activating throughout the station, Mick reported through the bond connection as compromised personnel began sabotaging life support systems, communication networks, and security protocols. They were creating weaknesses for the external assault. The attack is coordinated to eliminate defensive capabilities while creating evidence that Valkyrie extremists destroyed their own peace negotiation facility. The defensive systems are detecting unauthorized explosive devices throughout the station, Lyra confirmed. Her consciousness merged with his to coordinate countermeasures while accessing threat assessment networks revealing the scope of corporate conspiracy. But the hidden defenses can protect against the sabotage if we complete the Bond Warden activation. The ceremony continued with corporate agents already moving through the facility. Their attacks were designed to use the security weaknesses that systematic infiltration had been creating over months of preparation. Mick and the twins did the formal bonding while simultaneously coordinating the exposure of corporate conspiracy to Frontier Command networks. These networks had been operating under corrupted intelligence about the source of attacks on diplomatic facilities. Michael Harrison, he said as bioneural scanners confirmed his permanent integration with Valkyrie defensive systems, accept the Bond Warden responsibility with the understanding that protective technology serves both species security rather than the corporate interests that profit from artificial conflicts. And we, Lyra and Miravel, they replied together. Their consciousness was now permanently linked to his through bonding protocols, creating unprecedented cooperation between human strategic thinking and Valkyrie defensive technology. Confirm the partnership and commit to defensive cooperation that protects diplomatic efforts rather than the corporate war profiteering that has been systematically eliminating peace negotiation facilities. The ceremony's completion turned on comprehensive defensive networks. These not only protected the station from the immediate assault, but also exposed corporate infiltrators throughout the frontier zone. They broadcast evidence of the systematic sabotage that had been preventing successful diplomatic cooperation between species. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of corporate conspiracy designed to eliminate defensive capabilities while keeping profitable conflicts going. This was done through systematic attacks on diplomatic facilities blamed on extremist groups rather than corporate manipulation. The evidence led to mass arrests of corporate agents, the breakup of war profiteering networks, and the creation of new defensive protocols. These protected peace negotiations from corporate sabotage. 6 months later, Mick found himself working as Chief of Frontier Defense Coordination aboard the joint Human-Valkyrie Command vessel Guardian. His military expertise and Bond Warden authority made sure defensive systems protected diplomatic efforts rather than serving corporate interests that wanted frontier zones to stay in profitable conflict. The defensive networks are working perfectly across all frontier territories, he reported to Lyra and Miravel, who now coordinated ancient Valkyrie technology while keeping their partnership with human strategic capabilities. No corporate infiltration, no systematic sabotage, and definitely no false flag attacks designed to eliminate diplomatic facilities. The peace negotiations are succeeding beyond projections, Lyra confirmed. Her glowing markings glowed with colors Mick's enhanced awareness recognized as deep satisfaction mixed with contentment. Frontier settlements are creating permanent cooperation rather than the temporary truces corporate interests had been systematically undermining. The evening routine they developed involved reviewing defensive protocols while sharing the kind of family conversation that had become natural through months of bonded partnership. Mick could access the twins' understanding of ancient technology while they could benefit from his strategic analysis of threats needing both technological and psychological countermeasures. Any regrets about accidentally becoming guardian to alien children with access to defensive technology spanning star systems? Miravel asked with the smile that had become his favorite part of their shared consciousness. Only that it took Papa's elimination by corporate agents for us to find someone whose protection philosophy includes enough personal investment to resist the profitable conflicts war profiteers try to keep going through systematic elimination of defensive capabilities, Mick replied. The best guardianship, Lyra said, is always the kind that protects people from threats they can't counter alone, especially when those threats involve systematic manipulation by interests that like vulnerability over effective protection. As they settled into the shared defensive planning that had become their evening routine, a practice combining advanced technology with family bonds, making sure defensive capabilities serve protection rather than exploitation, Mick thought about the journey. From routine security assignment to partnership with remarkable children whose trust had made him responsible for defensive networks protecting diplomatic cooperation throughout the frontier zone. "You know," he said, feeling their shared consciousness settling into the peaceful synchronization that marked successful integration of human strategic thinking with Valkyrie defensive philosophy. "When I arrived at Alpha 7, I expected standard security duties at a frontier diplomatic facility." "And now?" Lyra asked. "Now I realize I was being evaluated for the most important security responsibility in the frontier zone. Protecting not just individual facilities, but the entire concept of diplomatic cooperation from corporate interests that like profitable conflicts more than successful peace negotiations." Mick paused, accessing their shared understanding of how completely their professional and family relationships had blended. "It's either the most successful accidental adoption in military history or the most elaborate way anyone's ever discovered they were meant to protect something larger than individual missions or personal advancement." "Why not both?" Miravel replied. Her consciousness touched his with the partnership that had become the foundation of their collaboration. "Though we prefer to think of it as the most successful defensive partnership ever turned on. One where the Guardian and the Protected discovered that the most important security comes from people who choose to care about each other's welfare rather than the profitable weaknesses corporate interests try to keep between potential allies. The best defensive systems," Mick agreed, "are always the ones that protect relationships rather than just territory or resources." Michael Harrison had started as someone who provided security for individual facilities during routine frontier assignments. He'd ended up as someone who provided security for the concept of peaceful cooperation itself. He protected diplomatic relationships from corporate interests that wanted civilizations to stay in artificial conflict for profitable exploitation. One accidentally accepted guardianship at a time. And somehow in the process, he discovered the most important military service of his career hadn't been tactical. It had been the building of family bonds strong enough to operate advanced defensive technology. Technology that needed personal investment rather than professional distance. Especially when that technology was designed to protect the vulnerable from those who would use their defenselessness for profit. The twins had taught him that true security wasn't about controlling territory or eliminating threats. It was about building relationships strong enough to make exploitation impossible and cooperation inevitable. Every evening as they reviewed defensive protocols together, Mick was reminded that the most sophisticated weapon systems in the galaxy were useless without the trust and emotional investment that made someone willing to use them for protection rather than conquest. "Papa always said," Lyra mentioned during one of their planning sessions, "that the defensive systems work best when they're operated by people who understand that the goal isn't to defeat enemies, but to make it impossible for anyone to benefit from creating enemies in the first place." "Corporate interests profit from fear and separation," Miravel added, with the wisdom that came from having lived through their parents' elimination by those same interests. "But when people choose to protect each other, there's no profit in making conflicts between them." As Mick looked out at the frontier settlements that now grew strong under the protection of defensive networks operated through bonds of genuine care rather than military protocol, he realized something. His 2 young charges had changed him from a soldier who followed orders into a guardian who understood that the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with the decision to choose cooperation over the profitable conflicts others tried to keep going through manipulation and fear. The Bond Warden partnership had given him more than access to advanced technology. It had given him a family worth protecting and a purpose worth the risks that came with standing against those who wanted civilizations to stay vulnerable to exploitation rather than strong enough to choose peace.